In the dust of ancient time, where gods bled and mortals defied the stars, stories were born that refused to die. This is not history, it is myth, a deeper truth, told in fragments and firelight, carried across centuries by poets and silence alike. You're watching Dinoscope, where we breathe life into forgotten legends. Each tale a descent, each voice a whisper from the underworld of memory.
Orpheus and Eurydice, Act 1. In the morning of the world, when gods still walked close to mortals, and the boundary between the seen and unseen realms was thin as morning mist, there lived in Thrace a man whose gift set him apart from all others, who drew breath beneath the sun. Orpheus was his name, and in his hands the lyre became something more than wood and string and bronze. It became the voice of creation itself. Born of the muse Calliope, mistress of epic song, and touched by Apollo's golden light, Orpheus carried divinity in his blood. Yet he walked among mortals, and his heart beat as theirs did, swift with joy, heavy with sorrow, quick with love. When he sang, the world itself leaned close to listen. Wild deer would emerge from their forest shadows, trembling not with fear, but with something like recognition. Eagles would circle lower, forgetting their hunt. Even the trees, those ancient witnesses, would bend their crowns toward the sound, and the very stones would shift in their beds, as if remembering some primordial music from the earth's first dawn. The shepherds of Thrace spoke of him in whispers, as men speak of things half sacred, half feared. They told of wolves that lay down beside their sheep when Orpheus passed, of storms that gentled into soft rain at the sound of his voice. In the courts of kings, his name was known as one who could ease the madness of tyrants and turn the hearts of warriors from blood to beauty. Yet Orpheus himself moved through the world with a strange solitude, as if his gift set him apart from common fellowship, as if he were listening always to some music that others could not hear. His dwelling place was simple. A shepherd's hut on the slopes of Mount Pangaion, where the wind sang always through the rocks and the stars seemed close enough to pluck like silver fruit. There he would sit through the long nights, conversing with his lyre as with a beloved friend, drawing from it sounds that had no names in any mortal tongue. Sometimes the mountain itself seemed to answer, echoing his melodies in voices of stone and snow. It was in the fullness of spring when Orpheus first beheld Eurydice. He had descended from his mountain solitude to join the festivals of the season, when mortals honor the returning life of the world. She moved through the meadows like light upon water, a wood nymph whose grace belonged half to the mortal world and half to something older, deeper. Her sisters called her Eurydice, wide justice, or perhaps wide wandering, and in her eyes was the green shadow of ancient forests, the silver flash of hidden streams. Their meeting was like the confluence of two rivers that had always been meant to flow as one. She had been dancing with her sister nymphs, their movements weaving patterns that echoed the greater dance of seasons and stars. But when Orpheus's music reached them, for he had been playing softly to himself, seated on a stone at the meadow's edge, Eurydice stopped as if struck. The melody seemed to call her by name, though no words were sung. It spoke of loneliness ended, of questions answered, of home found in another's heart. She approached him through the tall grass, and Orpheus, looking up, felt his fingers falter on the strings for the first time in memory. Here was something his music had been seeking without knowing it sought. Their eyes met across the diminishing distance, and in that moment, the music that had always lived within Orpheus found its perfect theme. He sang to her then, not with words at first, but with pure melody that spoke of recognition, of finding the other half of one's soul walking free beneath the sky. "I know you," the music said without words. "I have always known you. In every song I ever sang, I was calling to you. In every silence between the notes, I was listening for your answer." And Eurydice, who had danced to the music of wind and water all her life, heard in his song something that made all other music seem like echoes of this true sound. She sank down beside him on the grass, and they sat together as the sun made its journey across the sky, neither speaking, for what need had they of words when the lyre could say everything? Their courtship unfolded like a song itself, each day a new verse, each meeting a deepening of harmony. Orpheus would come down from his mountain, and Eurydice would emerge from her forest haunts, and they would meet in the spaces between, meadows that belonged to neither mountain nor wood, but partook of both. He taught her the formal melodies of men, the hymns and paeans that mortals sang to move the gods. She taught him the wilder music of growing things, the songs that moss sings to stone, that roots sing to earth. Together they discovered a new music, neither wholly mortal nor wholly divine, but something unprecedented, the sound of two souls learning to beat in rhythm. Eurydice, who had heard the streams sing and the wind make melodies in the leaves, had never known music like this. It was as if Orpheus's lyre could voice the very thing her heart had always yearned to say, but never found words for. And Orpheus, who had made stones weep and storms grow calm, discovered that all his music had been mere practice for this, for singing the name of his beloved. The beasts of field and forest bore witness to their love. Birds would follow them in great murmurations, adding their voices to Orpheus's songs. Once, a bear emerged from the woods while they sat together, and instead of fleeing, Eurydice laughed as the great creature settled beside them like a hound, its fierce eyes gentle as it listened to Orpheus play. Even the bees seemed to dance more purposefully when the lovers passed, as if their humming sought to harmonize with the greater music that surrounded the pair. When at last they stood together to be wed, all of nature bore witness. The day chosen was at spring's height, when the world itself seems drunk on its own renewal. Hymenaeus himself, god of marriage, descended from Olympus to bless their union, though the omens troubled those who knew how to read such things. The marriage god arrived with unaccustomed gravity, his usual joy muted. His torch, which should have burned bright and clear as young love itself, sputtered and smoked, refusing to burn clean. The smoke that rose from it drew tears from every eye it touched, though none could say why they wept. Still, the joy of the lovers outshone these shadows. How could it not? Here was Orpheus, whose music could reshape reality itself, wedding Eurydice, in whom the wild beauty of the world was made manifest. Their happiness seemed large enough to rewrite any fate, bright enough to burn away any doom. Orpheus sang their wedding song, and for a moment it seemed that sorrow itself had been banished from the world. The very air shimmered with joy made audible, and those who heard it would remember that song for all their days, though afterward the memory would carry pain as well as beauty. The nymphs of wood and water came to honor Eurydice, their sister who had chosen mortality's bond. They brought gifts of flower crowns that would never fade, water from sacred springs, honey from the hives of the gods' own bees. They danced in circles that seemed to mirror the greater turnings of the stars, their bare feet blessing the earth. The patterns they wove were old beyond memory, speaking in movement what words could never capture. Joy and sorrow intertwined, endings and beginnings spinning together like partners in an eternal dance. Eurydice danced among them, radiant as the moon, while Orpheus played melodies that made the very air shimmer with joy. His fingers on the lyre strings seemed to pull down starlight and weave it into sound. The music rose and fell like breathing, like laughter, like the pulse of life itself. Even the trees at the forest's edge swayed in time, and the grass rippled in waves that had nothing to do with wind. The celebration stretched from dawn through the day and into the star-drunk night. Wine flowed like dark rivers, and laughter rose like birds taking wing. Mortals and immortals mingled freely, for in that time the boundaries were not yet fixed in stone. A satyr played his pipes in harmony with Orpheus's lyre, and for once his music was not wild and maddening, but sweet as summer rain. The centaurs came down from their mountain halls, bearing gifts of ancient vintage, and even they, usually so quick to quarrel in their cups, remained peaceful throughout the feast. But the Fates, those three sisters who spin and measure and cut the threads of every life, had already woven this day's joy with tomorrow's grief. Perhaps they sat at their loom even then, in whatever place, beyond place, they keep their vigil. And perhaps Clotho's hand trembled as she spun the thread, and Lachesis measured but a brief span, and Atropos held her shears ready. Even as the wedding guests sang and feasted, the pattern was set. Perhaps it is always thus, that the greatest happiness carries within it the seed of the greatest sorrow, as the brightest day casts the darkest shadow. The bride and groom knew nothing of this. How could they? They moved in a golden bubble of present joy, touching hands, sharing glances that held whole conversations, drunk on each other's presence more than any wine. When Orpheus sang of their future years together, his voice painted pictures in the air. Children who would inherit his gift of music and her grace of movement, peaceful days growing old together, a love that would deepen with each passing season, like wine growing richer in the cask. In the soft hours of the morning after, when the wedding guests had departed, and the world seemed new made for the lovers, Eurydice walked out into the meadows. The marriage bower was sweet, but something in her, that part that was still wild nymph, still creature of the open spaces, needed sky above and earth below. Some say she went with her sister nymphs to continue the celebrations in their wilder way, to dance the dances that mortal eyes should not see, to singing the songs that only the initiated know. Others tell that she walked alone, her heart so full of happiness that she needed the wide sky to contain it. The grass was heavy with dew, and the early light turned each drop to a tiny sun. She moved through it like a swimmer through gentle waves, her wedding garment trailing behind her, leaving a path of bent stems that caught the light. Her feet were bare. She had kicked off her sandals to feel the earth's blessing on her skin. The morning was perfect, touched with that peculiar quality of timelessness that comes sometimes in the hour after dawn, when the world seems to pause in its turning. She sang as she walked, not with Orpheus's skill, but with the natural music of happiness. Her voice rose and fell with the meadowlark's call, harmonized with the drone of early bees, found rhythm in the whisper of grass against grass. The flowers seemed to turn their faces to follow her passage, violets and wild roses, poppies that grew at the field's edge like drops of spilled blood. That image would return to haunt those who later heard the tale. But in the moment, Eurydice saw only beauty. Perhaps she was thinking of Orpheus, still sleeping in their marriage bed, his face peaceful, as she had never seen it in waking. For even in joy, he carried always that touch of divine restlessness that marked him as one caught between worlds. Perhaps she was thinking of the children they would have, the home they would make, the years stretching ahead like a road through a summer landscape. Or perhaps she thought nothing at all, but simply was, present in her body, in the morning, in the fullness of life that seemed in that moment eternal and unassailable. But in that grass, coiled and waiting, lay a serpent. Some say it was just a common viper, driven from its usual haunts by the wedding's revelry. Others whisper that it was more, a creature of jealousy and spite, sent by some god or spirit who could not bear to see such happiness in the mortal realm. Perhaps it was chance, the simple intersection of two paths in the vastness of the world. Perhaps it was something more, the jealousy of earth toward those who love too well, or simply the turning of fortune's wheel that raises one high only to cast them down. The snake struck swift as thought, its fangs finding the tender flesh of Eurydice's heel. She cried out, once sharp and surprised, and the sound carried across the meadows like the breaking of a string on some cosmic lyre. For a moment she stood frozen, looking down at the serpent as it slithered away, its work done. Then the pain came, and with it the knowledge of what this meant. The venom worked quickly, fire racing through her veins, turning her limbs to stone, her vision to shadow. She fell among the flowers that just moments before had seemed to dance for her joy. Her hands clutched at the grass as if she could anchor herself to life by holding tight to the earth. But already she could feel herself becoming lighter, less substantial, as if the morning sun was shining through her instead of upon her. Orpheus, she whispered, and the wind caught the name and carried it like a seed of sorrow on the breeze. Her thoughts in those last moments were not for herself, but for him, for the grief that would tear him apart, for the music that would turn from joy to lamentation. She tried to rise, to run back to him, to have one last moment in his arms, but her legs would not obey, and the world was growing dim around the edges, like a dream upon waking. Her sister nymphs found her there, already growing cold, her eyes reflecting the sky but seeing nothing. Their lamentations rose like a storm wind, carrying the news swift as sorrow flies. The birds took up the cry, and the very trees seemed to shudder with the knowledge. And Orpheus, who had been composing a song of gratitude to the gods for his happiness, felt the music die in his throat before the first messenger reached him. He knew, as lovers know, that the other half of his soul had been torn away. The lyre fell from his hands, striking a discord that seemed to crack the morning like breaking glass. He ran then, barefoot and wild, following the sound of weeping that drew him like a terrible magnetism. The path to the meadow had never seemed so long. His feet found every stone, every thorn, but he felt nothing except the growing certainty of loss that pressed upon his chest like a physical weight. When they brought her body to him, pale as winter moonlight, still as the stones he had once made dance, something broke within Orpheus that could never be made whole again. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering above her face, afraid to touch and confirm what his eyes already knew. Her beauty remained, but it was the beauty of marble now, perfect and cold and forever unreachable. His first sound was not a cry, but a note, low and terrible and beautiful, a sound that had never before emerged from any mortal throat. It was grief given voice, loss made manifest in the air. Those who heard it fell to their knees, for it carried within it every sorrow that had ever been or ever would be. The note rose and expanded, filling the meadow, the forest, rising up to trouble the gods in their golden halls. Even Olympus trembled at the sound of a heart breaking in real time. For 7 days and 7 nights, Orpheus neither ate nor drank nor slept. He sat beside Eurydice's body, and his lyre spoke what his voice could not. The music that poured forth was like nothing the world had heard. It was the sound of love become lamentation, of joy transformed into its opposite, yet somehow retaining the shape of what it had been. The notes seemed to make the very air weep. Rain fell from cloudless skies. The rivers swelled with tears that were not their own. Animals came from the forest to sit in silent vigil, and even the wind held its breath to listen. On the 8th day, when custom could no longer be denied, they built the pyre. Friends and strangers alike brought wood, each piece laid with reverence, for all who had heard Orpheus's lament understood that they witnessed something beyond common grief. The flames that took Eurydice's earthly form seemed gentle, almost reverent, as if fire itself grieved to perform this last duty. Orpheus played as she burned, his music rising with the smoke, carrying something of her essence up toward the dwelling places of the gods. The melody he played then would never be repeated, could never be repeated, for it was woven from the very substance of his love and loss. Those who heard it said later that they could see Eurydice in the music, see her dancing in the meadow, see her turning to smile at her beloved, see her falling among the flowers. The smoke that rose from the pyre seemed to take her shape for a moment, and some swore they saw her raise one translucent hand in farewell before the wind scattered her into nothing. When nothing remained but ashes and memory, Orpheus stood silent for a long moment, his lyre quiet against his chest. The mourners waited, uncertain, for what comes after such grief. What words could possibly follow such music? But Orpheus spoke no words. Instead, he began to walk, not toward his mountain home, not toward the comfort of human habitation, but toward the west, where the sun was already beginning its descent. Then Orpheus did what no mortal had done before, with thought of return. He turned his back on the sun and began to walk toward the places where shadows grow long and the earth opens into darker realms. For in his grief-struck mind, a thought had taken root, growing from impossible seed into desperate flower. If his music could move stones and tame wild beasts, if it could make the gods themselves pause in their celestial dancing, might it not also move the cold heart of death? Might it not win back what had been stolen? The other mourners tried to stop him, but Orpheus walked through their grasping hands like a man in a dream. His feet found the ancient paths that lead downward, the roads that living men are not meant to know. Behind him, the sun grew small and distant. Before him, shadows gathered like a congregation, waiting to hear what song this mourner would sing in the halls of the dead. He carried nothing but his lyre and his love and his grief. But these, he thought, might be enough. For what force in heaven or earth or under the earth could stand against a love that refused to accept its own ending? What power could deny a music born from the marriage of mortal pain and divine art? In his mind, he could see her waiting in the gray halls below, could hear her voice calling to him across the void. The rational part of him, the part that knew the laws of gods and men, whispered that this was madness. But madness and love had always been close cousins, and grief made them closer still. The entrance to the underworld yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial titan, breathing out the cold air of eternity. At Taenarus, at the world's edge, where the land gave way to darker mysteries, the cave opened in the cliff face like a wound that would not heal. The living world sounds grew faint behind him, birdsong and wind, and the distant music of streams. Ahead lay silence, the vast and patient quiet of the dead. Orpheus stood at the threshold for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he was about to attempt. No living man had walked this path with hope of return. Heroes had ventured here, Heracles on his labors, Theseus in his folly. But they had come as conquerors, not supplicants. Orpheus came with empty hands and a full heart, bearing no weapons but his art, seeking no glory but love's restoration. He touched his fingers to the lyre strings, drawing forth a single note that seemed to hang in the air like a question. The darkness before him shivered at the sound, as if even shadow could be moved by music. Then, with the courage that only love can lend, he stepped forward into the darkness, beginning his descent to the throne of Hades himself. The shadows parted before him like curtains, and the path downward opened like a throat ready to swallow. But Orpheus did not falter. He had already lost everything that made life worth living. What more could even death take from him now? Each step downward was a word in the argument he would make before the lords of the dead. Each note that fell from his lyre was a reason why the laws of nature should bend, just this once, for love. And so began the journey that would be sung of for millennia to come. The lover's descent, the artist's greatest performance, the mortal who dared to argue with mortality itself. Behind him, the circle of light that was the world grew smaller and smaller, until it was no more than a distant star in the darkness. Before him, the realm of shadows opened its gray arms in what might have been welcome or warning. The darkness swallowed him whole, but within it, his lyre began to sing, a song of love that refused to die, of music that could not be silenced, of hope that persisted even in the very halls of hopelessness. And perhaps in the depths below, a shadow that had once been Eurydice heard that music and remembered what it was to hope. Act 2. The path downward wound through stone and shadow, each step carrying Orpheus further from the world of the living. At first, the way was merely dim, like walking through a forest at twilight. But as he descended, true darkness gathered around him. Not the simple absence of light that mortals know, but something denser, older, heavy with the weight of all the lives that had passed this way never to return. His lyre provided the only illumination, not with any visible light, but with sound that seemed to make the darkness navigable, as if the notes could feel their way through the gloom. The air grew colder with each downward step, carrying scents that belonged to no living place. Stone that had never known sunlight, water that had never reflected sky, the faint metallic tang of the rivers that divide the living from the dead. Orpheus's breath misted before him, each exhalation a small ghost fleeting upward, as if even his breath sought to escape this realm while it could. Strange sounds reached him through the darkness, whispers that might have been wind, or might have been the sighs of countless souls, the distant clank of chains, the splash of oars in water that no mortal boat should sail. But beneath it all was silence, the profound quiet that comes not from absence of sound, but from the presence of ending. It was the silence that waits after the last note of a song, extended into eternity. His fingers moved on the lyre strings of their own accord, drawing forth a melody that had never been played before and would never be played again. It was a song of descent, each note falling like a stone into dark water, creating ripples of sound that spread outward through the shadows. The music spoke of the world above, sunlight on leaves, the warmth of skin against skin, the taste of wine and bread and morning air. It was a reminder and a plea combined, saying, "I am alive, I am love. I do not belong here, but I have come." The first guardian he encountered was not the ferryman, as the tales would later tell, but something older and less defined, a presence in the darkness that was darkness itself given form and hunger. It rose before him like a wave of night, and Orpheus felt it testing the boundaries of his mortality, pressing against the warm bubble of life he carried within him. For a moment, his fingers faltered on the strings, and in that pause, the darkness surged closer, eager to claim him. But then Orpheus sang, not just played, but gave voice to his music for the first time since entering this realm. He sang of Eurydice, of the morning she died, of love cut short by fate's cruel jest. The darkness paused, held by something it had never encountered before. Beauty that acknowledged death yet did not surrender to it. Slowly, like a great tide receding, the presence withdrew, leaving the path clear. Orpheus understood then that his music was more than passport here. It was a light that even the oldest darkness must respect. The path opened onto the shores of the Styx, that river which mortals name but do not truly know. It was not water as the living understand water, but something thicker, darker, carrying within its flow the memory of every tear ever shed, every sorrow ever suffered. The far shore was invisible in the gloom, and the river's width seemed to change with looking, now narrow as a stream, now broad as the sea itself. Charon waited at his eternal post, the ferryman who had plied these waters since before the gods were young. His boat was made of shadows and forgetfulness, held together by the weight of duty and the coins of the dead. He was old beyond age, his face a map of sorrows, witnessed but not felt, his eyes empty as the sockets of a skull, yet somehow still seeing. When he spoke, his voice was the whisper of oars in dark water, the settling of grave earth, the last breath leaving the body. "You have no coin," the ferryman said, and it was not a question. "You have no right of passage. The living do not cross this water." Orpheus lifted his lyre in answer. The first notes that sprang from the strings were silver bright, coins of sound spinning through the darkness. He played of journeys and destinations, of rivers crossed in hope and faith, of the ferryman's long labor and longer loneliness. He played of Charon himself, not as the grim figure legend painted, but as the last kind hand that guides the fearful dead to their rest, the necessary bridge between what was and what must be. The ferryman's ancient hands grew still upon his oar. Something shifted in those empty eyes, not quite emotion, but perhaps the memory of emotion, like an echo of what it once meant to feel. When Orpheus began to sing, adding words to the melody, Charon did something he had not done since before memory began. He wept. The tears that fell from those hollow eyes were not water, but something stranger, the crystallized sorrow of ages falling like dark jewels into the darker river. "Bored," Charon said when the song ended, his voice rougher than before, as if those tears had carved new channels in it. "But know this, living man, I ferry you across, but I make no promise of return. The river flows one way only, and I am bound by laws older than your gods." The journey across the Styx was like sailing through liquid night. The boat moved without wind or current, propelled by Charon's will alone. Around them, the river whispered with voices of the dead, not words, but the sound words leave behind when meaning has been stripped away. Orpheus played softly as they traveled, his music a small sphere of warmth and memory in the cold flow of forgetfulness. On the far shore, the true realm of the dead began. Here was the field of asphodel, where countless souls wandered in gray twilight, neither happy nor sad, but simply diminished. They were shadows of who they had been, retaining the shape but not the substance of life. As Orpheus passed among them, his music drew them like moths to flame. They pressed close, these faded spirits, reaching out with hands that could not quite touch, yearning toward the music with a hunger they could no longer name. He played for them as he walked, played memories of sunshine and laughter, of small daily joys and grand passions. Some of the shadows grew more solid as they listened, their features sharpening as if his music restored, however briefly, some hint of who they had been. A woman who might have been a baker in life smiled as his song recalled the scent of fresh bread. A warrior's shade stood straighter, remembering honor and purpose. Children's spirits laughed, though no sound came from their insubstantial throats. But Orpheus could not linger, though pity moved him. Somewhere in this gray realm, or deeper still, Eurydice waited. He hardened his heart against the pleading looks of the forgotten dead and pressed onward, following paths that seemed to shift and change with each step, as if the geography of death was not fixed, but fluid, shaped by the expectations and fears of those who walked here. The way grew darker and more terrible as he descended. He passed the pool where Tantalus stood in eternal hunger and thirst, reaching forever for fruit that withdrew from his grasp, stooping to drink water that receded from his lips. When Orpheus's music reached him, the old sinner paused in his futile efforts, and for the first time in ages, beyond counting, the fruit hung still, and the water did not flee. Tantalus did not reach for them. Instead, he stood transfixed by the music, and on his face was an expression of satiation, more complete than any food or drink could provide. Further on, Sisyphus labored with his boulder, pushing it up the hillside only to watch it roll back down, over and over in endless repetition. But when the notes of Orpheus's lyre found him, the condemned king stopped his pushing and simply listened. The boulder, too, grew still, balanced impossibly on the slope, as if even stone could be charmed by such music. Sisyphus sat upon his burden and wept, not tears of frustration, but of something like joy, hearing in the music a reminder of what it meant to rest. The vultures that eternally tore at Tityus's liver paused in their feast, heads cocked to catch the melody. Ixion's wheel ceased its spinning, giving the bound king his first respite from dizzy torment. Even the Furies themselves, those ancient avengers with snakes for hair and blood for tears, found their rage quieted by the song. They listened with something approaching wonder on their terrible faces, and the snakes in their hair swayed gently, as if dancing to the rhythm. Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guards the gates of the deeper realm, should have been Orpheus's greatest challenge. The beast was vast as a hill and dark as midnight, with teeth like swords and eyes like burning coals. Each of his heads was large enough to swallow a man whole, and his bark could shatter stones and drive the dead themselves to deeper despair. He rose as Orpheus approached, all three throats growling a warning that shook the ground. But Orpheus neither faltered nor fled. Instead, he played a song of dogs, not the monstrous guardian before him, but the simple, loyal hounds of the upper world. He sang of faithful companions waiting by doorways for masters who would come home, of puppies tumbling in spring grass, of the ancient friendship between human and hound that began when both were young in the world. His music spoke to something buried deep beneath Cerberus's terrible exterior, some memory of what it meant to be loved rather than feared. The great dog's growls softened to whines. One by one, the three heads lowered, and the burning eyes dimmed to something almost gentle. Cerberus lay down before the gates, his tail, that serpent thing that writers would later describe, actually wagging slightly. As Orpheus passed, one of the heads stretched out to sniff his hand, and he paused to stroke the midnight fur, feeling beneath it a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires of punishment. Beyond Cerberus lay the palace of the dead, and here Orpheus's courage almost failed him. The building, if building it could be called, was vast beyond mortal comprehension, its walls made of compressed shadows, its pillars carved from crystallized screams. It existed in more dimensions than living eyes could process, so that looking at it too long brought vertigo and madness. This was the seat of power for the lords of the dead, the throne room where Hades and Persephone held court over their gray kingdom. Orpheus walked through halls where the walls wept black tears, and the floor was paved with the broken promises of the living. Strange courtiers passed him, not the simple shades of the fields above, but older things, darker things, beings that had never known sunlight and never wished to. They whispered among themselves as he passed, and their whispers were like the sound of earth falling on coffin lids. At last, he came to the throne room itself, and here was a sight to stop the heart of even the bravest hero. The space was vast as a night sky turned inside out, lit by a light that was not light, but visible darkness. Two thrones dominated the chamber, carved from single blocks of shadow stone that seemed to absorb hope itself. Upon them sat the lords of the dead. Hades was terrible in his majesty, a figure of such absolute authority that the air itself seemed to bow in his presence. His face was neither cruel nor kind, but implacable as the grave itself. In his hand was a scepter that commanded the obedience of every soul that had ever died, and his crown was wrought from the darkness that waited before the first star was lit. To look upon him was to understand, truly understand, that death was not a person, but a law, and Hades was that law-given form. Beside him sat Persephone, and she was terrible in a different way. Where Hades was endings, she was transformations. Where he was finality, she was the strange beauty that blooms in decay. She was spring's daughter dwelling in winter's house, and in her face was both the memory of flowers and the patience of seeds waiting in dark earth. Her beauty was not diminished by her realm, but had become something richer and stranger, like a rose that bloomed black petals. Around the throne room stood the court of the dead, judges and ministers, servants and counselors, all the machinery of death's governance. They watched Orpheus with eyes that held no sympathy, for sympathy was a luxury the dead could not afford. He was an anomaly, a disruption in the ordered procession of souls, and they waited to see how their lords would deal with this unprecedented intrusion. Orpheus stood before the thrones, suddenly aware of how small and mortal he was, how presumptuous his mission. What was his grief against the grief of all the world? What was his loss against the losses tallied here every moment of every day? But then he thought of Eurydice, her laughter, her warmth, the way she moved through the world like dancing, and he lifted his lyre. The first note rang through the throne room like a bell struck in a tomb. It was pure and clear and absolutely alive, and its presence here was shocking as blood on snow. The assembled dead drew back from it, but Hades and Persephone leaned forward on their thrones, interested despite themselves. For here was something new in their ancient realm, and even gods grow weary of the same songs sung forever. Orpheus played as he had never played before. His fingers found notes between the notes, harmonies that existed in the spaces between sound and silence. He did not play of death. What could he tell these powers that they did not already know? Instead, he played of life, but life as the dead might remember it, life as precious because it ends. He played of morning coffee and evening wine, of the weight of a sleeping lover's head on one's shoulder, of arguments and reconciliations, of all the tiny, vital moments that make up a life. Then he began to sing, and his voice was his heart made audible. He sang not to the king and queen before him, but to the entire realm of the dead, to every soul that had ever loved and lost, to the very stones of this underground palace that had heard so much sorrow. He sang Eurydice's name, and in that name was every beloved name ever called into the darkness. He sang of their meeting, their wedding, their parting, and in his song was every meeting, every wedding, every parting that had ever been. I come not as hero or conqueror, he sang, not to challenge your rule or steal from your realm. I come as all men come to you eventually, brought here by love and loss. But I come too soon, and I come asking for what has never been granted. A second chance, a revision of the story, a dawn after the darkest night. You who rule here know all endings, but do you remember beginnings? You who catalog all sorrows, do you recall joy? My wife lies in your halls, taken by chance and mischance, before her thread was measured out. The snake that bit her stole, decades that were ours by right. I do not ask you to break your laws, only to bend them, once for love. If you have ever loved, and Lord Hades, Did you not risk the wrath of all Olympus for Persephone? And lady, do you not remember the sunlight? And does your mother Demeter not mourn your absence half the year? Then you know why I am here. Not because I am brave, for I am not. Not because I am wise, for love has made me foolish. But because to live without her is not to live at all, and so I have nothing left to lose. Grant me this. Let Eurydice return with me to finish the life that was cut short. When her natural years are done, I swear by every oath that binds, we will return to you willingly, and our shades will serve in your halls gladly, knowing we were given the gift of completion. Deny me this, and you gain only one soul before its time, and break another that will never heal. Grant it, and you prove that even death can know mercy. The song ended, but its echo continued long after, reflected and refracted by the strange acoustics of the throne room, until it seemed the very walls were singing. In the silence that followed, something unprecedented happened. From the eyes of the Furies dripped tears, not blood, but true tears, salt and water and sorrow. The judges of the dead bowed their heads. Somewhere in the distance, the Styx itself seemed to pause in its flow. And on her throne, Persephone turned to her husband. What passed between them in that glance was a conversation of centuries, a weighing of law against mercy, precedent against exception. They were the balance, he the weight of law, she the possibility of exception. In her eyes was spring's argument against winter's certainty. At last, Hades spoke, and his voice was the closing of tomb doors, the settling of earth, the final silence. But in it, too, was something that might have been understanding. Never before, he said, has the law of death been broken for love. Heroes have come here with swords and strength, and they have failed or succeeded according to their power. But you come with empty hands and a full heart, and your weapon is beauty itself. How can we, who rule over endings, deny such a beginning? He raised his scepter, and the shadows in the room shifted and swirled. Let Eurydice be called forth. From the depths of the palace came a stirring, a movement of shadows that gradually took form. And there, pale as moonlight on water, insubstantial as morning mist, but unmistakably herself, was Eurydice. Her shade glided forward, and when she saw Orpheus, something like color returned to her ghostly features. She reached out to him, and he to her. But Persephone raised a hand before they could touch. "Hold," the queen said, and her voice was gentle as spring rain, but implacable as winter frost. A condition must be placed on this gift, for the laws of the universe bend but do not break. You may lead her back, Orpheus, by the same path you descended. But you must not look back at her until both of you stand complete in the sunlight of the upper world. Trust that she follows, for doubt will undo what love has won. This is the price of the impossible. Faith absolute and unquestioning. Orpheus nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. What was one condition against the miracle of reunion? What was a test of trust when weighed against resurrection? He turned to begin the journey back, and behind him, silent as shadows themselves, Eurydice's shade began to follow. The court of the dead watched them go in silence, and in that silence was both blessing and curse, hope and the foreknowledge of hope's failure. For they were the dead, and they knew how all stories end. But for this moment, in this eternal place, they allowed themselves to believe that perhaps, just once, love might prove stronger than law. As Orpheus led his silent follower back through the halls of shadow, his lyre sang a different song, no longer pleading but grateful, no longer sorrow but joy barely contained. Behind him, Eurydice's footsteps made no sound, cast no shadow, left no trace, but he could feel her presence like warmth at his back, like the memory of sunlight in a dark place. The journey upward began, and with each step, the weight of what they attempted pressed heavier on them both, for they were reversing the irreversible, unwriting what had been written, walking against the current of the river that flows only one way. And somewhere in the darkness between death and life, between trust and doubt, their fate waited to unfold. Act 3. The return journey began in silence so complete, it seemed another form of darkness. Orpheus led the way, his lyre quiet now against his chest, for he feared that music might somehow break the spell that allowed this impossible grace. Behind him, and he must believe she was behind him, must not doubt, must not look, Eurydice followed on feet that made no sound. Through the throne room's vastness they passed, and the assembled dead parted before them like a sea of shadows. Some reached out as if to touch Eurydice, to confirm that one of their number was truly returning to the lands above, but their ghostly hands passed through empty air. On Persephone's face was an expression unreadable, as ancient text, perhaps pity, perhaps foreknowledge, perhaps simply the patience of one who has seen seasons turn and knows that every spring bears within it the seeds of autumn. Cerberus stirred as they approached the gates, all three heads lifting in confusion. The great hound knew his duty, to prevent escape from the realm of the dead. But here was a puzzle beyond his understanding. The shade that passed was marked with the seal of Hades himself, bearing permission that overruled even the guardian's ancient purpose. The dog whined, a sound like distant thunder, and laid his heads back down. As Orpheus passed, he whispered thanks to the beast, and thought he heard, just for a moment, the whisper of footsteps behind him. But he did not turn. He must not turn. Into the fields of asphodel they climbed, and here the temptation grew stronger. The countless wandering shades pressed close again, drawn by some quality in Eurydice that spoke of exception, of hope where no hope should be. They moaned and whispered, and in their whispers Orpheus heard questions. Does she walk? Does she follow? Is she truly there? He shut his ears to their doubts, fixed his eyes on the path ahead, and trusted in the sound of silence where footsteps should be. Past Sisyphus they climbed, and the eternal prisoner called out, "Singer, your shadow has a shadow." But whether this was confirmation or mockery, Orpheus could not tell and dared not investigate. The boulder sat balanced on its impossible point, still enchanted by the memory of music. Past Tantalus, who opened his mouth as if to speak but said nothing, only watched them pass with eyes that held eternity. Past all the landmarks of torment, up and up, toward the world of the living. The darkness began to change in quality, still absolute, but somehow less dense, as if mixed with the mere absence of light rather than light's opposite. The air grew warmer by degrees, so slight that Orpheus could not be certain he wasn't imagining the change. How long had they walked? Time meant nothing in the realm of the dead, but surely hours had passed, perhaps days. His legs ached with the constant climb. His fingers itched to play his lyre. His throat burned with unsung songs. But strongest of all was the desire to turn, to look, to confirm what faith demanded he accept without proof. "Eurydice," he whispered, and immediately cursed himself for the weakness. No answer came. How could it? She was shade still, voiceless until the sun restored her fully to life. But the silence that followed his call seemed emptier somehow, and doubt crept into his heart like water into a cracked vessel. At the banks of the Styx, Charon waited with his boat. The ancient ferryman's face showed no surprise at their return. Perhaps nothing could surprise one who had witnessed the procession of souls since time's beginning. He gestured them aboard without a word, but as Orpheus stepped into the boat, he noticed that it settled deeper in the water than it had on the journey down. Weight behind him, invisible but real. His heart leaped with relief so sharp it was almost pain. She was there. She must be there. The crossing seemed both eternal and instant. The river of forgetfulness whispered its seductions, promising release from the torment of uncertainty. All Orpheus had to do was drink, and he would forget why he must not turn, forget the condition that bound him. But he kept his eyes fixed on the far shore, and his lips sealed against temptation. Behind him, nothing. No breath, no movement, no sign. Only faith, growing heavier with each stroke of Charon's oar. On the far shore, as they disembarked, the ferryman spoke. "The living," he said, his voice like distant water, "see only what they expect to see. The dead see what is. Remember this, singer." Whether warning or riddle, Orpheus could not pause to unravel it. The path upward called, and he must follow. Now came the true test. In the deepest parts of the underworld, surrounded by impossibilities, it had been easier somehow to accept one more impossible thing. But as they climbed toward the world of reason and daylight, each step made the situation more absurd. How could Eurydice be behind him? How could the dead return? What if the gods had tricked him, sending him back with nothing but false hope for company? What if he climbed alone, a fool talking to his own shadow? The path grew steeper, narrower. The walls pressed close, and Orpheus had to use his hands to climb in places, his lyre bumping against his back. In these moments of struggle, when all his attention focused on finding the next handhold, the next stable place for his feet, he could almost forget his doubt. But in the easier stretches, when the path leveled and widened, the questions returned with doubled force. He began to play games with himself, mental exercises to maintain faith. He would count 100 steps before allowing himself to whisper her name. Then 200, then 5. He recited in his mind every moment of their time together, building a wall of memory against the erosion of doubt. He composed songs in his head, symphonies of reunion, epithalamiums for their second wedding. Anything to keep from turning. The darkness began to gray, like black cloth fading with age. Somewhere ahead, impossibly far but growing closer, was the mouth of the cave, the threshold between worlds. Orpheus's heart began to race. Soon, so soon, he could turn and see her. Soon, this torture of faith would end, and they would stand together in the sunlight, laugh at the trial that now seemed so terrible, embrace with arms that could touch and hold and never let go. But with the growing light came growing fear. What if the condition was more complex than he'd understood? What if in the sunlight meant fully in the light, not just at the cave's mouth? What if he turned too soon by mere moments and lost everything? The instructions had seemed clear in Hades's throne room, but here, approaching the critical moment, every word seemed ambiguous, fraught with potential for misinterpretation. His steps slowed despite himself. Behind him, was that a sigh? The first sound she'd made since beginning this journey? Or was it just the wind finding its way down from the world above? He wanted to call out, to ask her to make some sign, but fear held his tongue. What if speaking to her counted as looking back? What if acknowledging her presence broke whatever spell allowed her to follow? The cave mouth appeared ahead like a wound in the darkness, bleeding light. It was still distant. 100 steps? 200? But Orpheus could see the quality of that light, could tell that it was true sunlight, not the false glow of the underworld. Afternoon light, golden and warm and real. The sight of it made his eyes water after so long in darkness, and he had to pause to let his vision adjust. In that pause, doubt struck with the force of a serpent's bite. The silence behind him was perfect, complete. No breathing, no footfalls, no rustle of cloth. He had climbed for hours, perhaps days, and in all that time, not one sound to confirm he didn't climb alone. What if this was the gods' cruel jest? What if they had sent him back with nothing but the illusion of hope? What if Eurydice remained in the halls below, waiting for him to realize his fool's errand? Please, he whispered to the air, to the gods, to whatever power might be listening. Just one sign, just the smallest sound to tell me I'm not alone. But the only answer was his own breathing, harsh in the tunnel's confines, and the distant call of birds from the world above. Real birds, living birds, their songs a reminder of everything he'd almost regained and might have already lost. 50 steps from the cave mouth. He could see details now, grass moving in the wind, the branch of a tree swaying across the opening. The smell of the upper world reached him, flowers and earth and the green scent of growing things. It was almost over. The test was nearly passed. All he had to do was maintain faith for 50 more steps, 40, 30. But a new fear seized him. What if Eurydice couldn't follow him into the light? What if she reached the cave mouth and could go no further, held back by some law he didn't understand? What if he emerged into the sunlight alone, turned to find her trapped just inside the darkness, visible but unreachable? The thought was unbearable. Better to know now, while he could still act, still plead, still return to beg the lords below for clearer terms. 20 steps. The sunlight was warm on his face now, the cave mouth wide before him. His shadow stretched back into the darkness. One shadow, only one, though he tried not to notice. The birds' songs grew louder, a chorus of life calling him home. But what was home without Eurydice? What was sunlight without her to share it? 10 steps. The fear was a living thing now, clawing at his chest, screaming in his mind. Every instinct demanded he turn. His neck muscles tensed with the effort of resistance. His hands trembled on the lyre. The golden light that should have meant triumph felt instead like judgment, illuminating his solitude. 5 steps. The grass was beneath his feet now, soft after the stone of the underworld. 4 steps. The sun full on his face, warm as a blessing. 3 steps. Almost clear of the cave, almost safe. 2 steps. 1. And here, at the very threshold of triumph, Orpheus's faith shattered like a lyre string pulled too tight. The silence behind him was unbearable, the uncertainty a weight greater than all the darkness of the underworld. He had to know. He had to see. What good was sunlight if he stood in it alone? He turned. For one perfect, terrible moment, he saw her. Eurydice stood just inside the cave's mouth, her form wavering between shadow and substance. She was exactly as he remembered, and utterly changed. Her eyes held depths that only the dead possess, her beauty now edged with the terrible knowledge of what lies beyond. Her hand was extended toward him, nearly touching the line where darkness met light, and on her face was an expression of such love and such sorrow that it would haunt him all his days. Their eyes met across the threshold between life and death, and in that meeting was everything. All their love, all their loss, all the might-have-beens crumbling to dust. Eurydice's lips moved, shaping words he would never hear. Perhaps it was his name. Perhaps it was forgiveness. Perhaps it was goodbye. Then, gentle as smoke dispersing in wind, she began to fade. Not dramatically, not with cries or struggles, but with the quiet inevitability of a dream upon waking. Her substance grew thinner, her outline less defined. She became transparent as glass, then as mist, then as memory. Her hand, still reaching toward him, was the last to go, fingers dissolving into air just as they crossed into the light. No! The word tore from Orpheus's throat, raw and ragged. He lunged forward, his arms passing through the space where she had been, finding nothing but empty air and the lingering chill of the grave. He fell to his knees at the cave's mouth, his hands clawing at shadows, trying to gather what could not be held. But she was gone. Again. Forever. The lyre fell from his nerveless fingers, striking a discord on the stones that seemed to echo through both worlds. The sound was like the breaking of the universe, like the end of music itself. Orpheus knelt there for a time beyond measuring, silent at first, then keening with a grief that made his earlier sorrow seem a shallow thing. This was grief compounded by guilt, loss multiplied by the knowledge that he had held salvation in his grasp and let it slip through faithless fingers. When he could move, again he tried to return. He stumbled back into the cave, down the path he had climbed with such hope. But the way was barred to him now. Where before the path had opened at his approach, now it closed. The darkness that had parted for his living warmth now stood solid as a wall. He beat his fists against it until they bled. He cried out to Hades and Persephone. He offered his life in exchange for one more chance. But the underworld was deaf to him now. He had been given a gift without precedent, and he had squandered it. There would be no second miracle. He staggered back to Charon's shore, but the ferryman was gone, the river impassable. The Styx flowed swift and dark and final, and no amount of music would summon the boat again. He was Orpheus still, master of melody, but his power meant nothing here. The dead might weep at his songs, but they could not help him. The gods below had shown mercy once. They would not be moved again. For 7 days and 7 nights, Orpheus haunted the entrance to the underworld, neither eating nor sleeping, sustained only by grief and desperate hope. He played every song he knew, invented new ones, wore his fingers raw on the lyre strings. The music that poured forth was beautiful and terrible, full of such longing that the very stones cracked with sorrow. But the path remained closed, the darkness impenetrable. Eurydice was lost to him, not by fate or chance this time, but by his own failing. On the 8th day, weakness and despair drove him back to the upper world. He emerged from the cave like a ghost himself, hollow-eyed and gaunt, his hair wild, his clothes tattered. The sun that had seemed so precious now hurt his eyes. The songs of birds were mockery. The beauty of the world was a bitter jest. For what good was beauty that Eurydice could not share? He could not return to his old life. How could he live in the places where they had been happy? How could he walk the paths they had walked together, see the meadows where they had met, pass the scorched ground where the wedding pyre had burned? Instead, he took to the wild places of Thrace, the deep forests and high mountains where human footprints rarely fell. There he made his home, if home it could be called. A life of wandering and solitude, with only his lyre for company. But even his music was changed. Where once he had sung of joy and beauty, now his songs were all of loss. He sang of Eurydice, always Eurydice, her laughter, her grace, the way morning light had caught in her hair. He sang of their brief happiness and its brutal ending, of his journey to reclaim her and his failure at the last. The notes that fell from his lyre were like tears made audible, and all who heard them wept, even if they knew not why. The wild beasts still came to hear him play, but now they came not in wonder, but in sympathy, recognizing in his music the voice of one who had learned the true weight of loss. Wolves lay beside him as he sang, their yellow eyes full of understanding. Bears brought him food he did not eat. Eagles circled overhead, carrying his laments to the sky. Even the trees seemed to bend closer, as if offering comfort they could not give. Orpheus rejected the company of humans, especially women. Many sought him out, drawn by his fame or his sorrow, or the terrible beauty of his music. Maidens came offering love, matrons offering comfort, priestesses offering forgetfulness. He turned them all away. His heart had room for only one love, and she was beyond all reaching. Some he sent away gently, with songs that explained without words why he could not accept what they offered. Others, more persistent, met with harsher rejection, until word spread that Orpheus had sworn off the company of women entirely. This was not precisely true, though the truth was perhaps stranger. In his grief and guilt, Orpheus had come to believe that his love for Eurydice had been too possessive, too grasping. He had looked back because he could not bear uncertainty, could not trust in what he could not see and hold. So now he practiced a different kind of love, distant, idealized, asking nothing in return. He sang of Eurydice not as she had been, but as she had become in his memory, perfected by loss, purified by distance. The seasons turned, and Orpheus's self-imposed exile deepened. He grew wild as the beasts he charmed, his hair long and tangled, his clothes mere rags. But his music grew ever more powerful, as if pain had unlocked chambers in his art that joy could never have reached. He could make the stones weep true tears now, could cause flowers to bloom out of season with a melody, could call down rain from cloudless skies with his laments. Yet with power came danger. His rejection of human company, particularly female company, began to be seen as an affront by some. In Thrace, where the worship of Dionysus ran wild and deep, the god's female followers, the Maenads, took particular offense. Here was a man who denied the god's greatest gift, the ecstasy of abandon, the joy of losing oneself in wine and dance and passion. Worse, his music spoke of constancy and fidelity, of love that outlasted death, ideas antithetical to the wild freedom the Maenads celebrated. Warnings came to him. carried on the wind or in the cries of birds. The very beasts that loved him grew restless, sensing danger approaching. But Orpheus, lost in his grief, paid no heed. What did he have to fear from death? It would only reunite him with Eurydice. What pain could touch him that was worse than what he had already endured? He continued his wanderings, his singing, his solitary communion with memory and regret. It was on a morning bright with false promise that they found him. He had spent the night on a hillside, playing to the stars, and had fallen asleep at dawn with his lyre still in his arms. He woke to the sound of wild music, pipes and drums and cymbals clashing in rhythms that spoke of madness rather than melody. The Maenads had come, a storm of women driven to frenzy by wine and religious ecstasy, their eyes holding no more human reason than a forest fire holds mercy. They surrounded him in a circle that tightened like a noose. Their leader, her face painted with wine and blood, pointed at him with a thyrsus wound with ivy and topped with a pine cone. "Here is the scorner of women," she cried. "Here is the one who spurns the god's gift of forgetfulness, who makes mockery of joy with his endless sorrow. Let him learn that those who reject life's pleasures must embrace life's pain." Orpheus stood slowly, his lyre in his hands. Even now, faced with death, his first instinct was to reach for music. He began to play. Not a lament this time, but a song of peace, of harmony, of the beauty that exists in order rather than chaos. For a moment, the melody held them. The Maenads paused in their advance, swaying to the rhythm despite themselves. The madness in their eyes flickered, and in that flicker was the possibility of salvation. But their leader would not be swayed. She raised her voice in a ululating cry that shattered the spell of Orpheus's music. The others took up the cry, and then the drums began again, louder and more frantic, drowning out the lyre's gentle voice. They began to throw things, first pine cones and small stones that Orpheus's music turned aside, the projectiles falling harmless at his feet. But as their frenzy grew and his music was overwhelmed by their noise, larger stones found their mark. A rock struck his hand, and for the first time in his life, Orpheus dropped his lyre. It fell to the ground with a sound like the world ending, its strings snapping, its frame cracking on the stones. Without it, he was just a man, mortal, vulnerable, alone. The Maenads saw their advantage and pressed forward, their hands reaching not to caress, but to rend. What happened next was too terrible for any song to hold. They tore at him as if he were not a man, but an idea they could destroy, a rebuke they could silence. In their divine madness, they had strength beyond mortal women, and Orpheus, who had never raised a hand in violence, could not defend himself, even had he wished to. He did not cry out, did not plead. His last word was a name, Eurydice. When their frenzy finally passed and they saw what they had done, even the Maenads were appalled. The greatest musician the world had ever known lay broken on the hillside, his golden voice forever stilled. In their madness, they had torn him limb from limb, scattering the pieces as if to ensure that such music could never rise again. But they could not destroy everything. His head, severed from his body, rolled down the hillside and into the river Hebrus. And here occurred the last miracle of Orpheus's tale. As the head was carried by the current, it continued to sing, not with breath or voice as mortals understand, but with something deeper, as if his very essence had become music and could not be silenced even by death. The waters of the Hebrus carried the song to the sea, and fishermen would later swear they heard his voice calling Eurydice's name across the waves. The lyre, too, survived, though broken. The Muses themselves came down from Olympus to gather the fragments, weeping for their grandson, who had honored them so well. They set the lyre among the stars, where it shines still as the constellation Lyra, playing silent music to the turning heavens. Zeus himself ordained this, declaring that such music should not be lost to the world entirely. The Maenads did not escape punishment for their crime. Dionysus, though they had acted in his name, was horrified by the destruction of such beauty. He transformed them into oak trees, rooted forever in the place of their crime, able to move only when the wind stirs their branches. And some say that when the wind is right, you can still hear them weeping for what they destroyed in their madness. As for Orpheus himself, his scattered remains were gathered by the Muses and buried at the foot of Mount Olympus, in a tomb that became a shrine. It was said that nightingales sang more sweetly there than anywhere else in the world, as if the very birds sought to continue the music that had been silenced. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to hear those nightingales and remember the poet who had dared so much for love. But the true end of the story lay not in the world above, but below. For when Orpheus's shade descended for the last time to the realm of Hades, he found what he had sought so desperately in life. There in the fields of Asphodel, no longer separated by the veil between living and dead, Eurydice waited for him. Their reunion held no words. What need had the dead for speech? But in their embrace was the completion of every broken song, the healing of every discord. Now they walk together in the gray twilight of the Underworld, and sometimes Orpheus plays his shadow lyre while Eurydice dances, and the dead pause in their wanderings to remember what it was to love. He can look at her as much as he wishes now, for there is nowhere else to go, no condition to break, no fear of loss. They are beyond all that, beyond hope and fear alike, together in the only way that lasts. Some say that on certain nights, when the constellation Lyra rises and the nightingales sing at Orpheus's tomb, you can hear an echo of their story on the wind, the music of meeting, the silence of loss, the song of reunion beyond the grave. It reminds those who hear it that love, for all its pain, is the only thing that follows us beyond death's threshold. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that was always the true song Orpheus was meant to sing. Not that love conquers death, but that love transcends it, transforms it, makes of ending another kind of beginning. In the halls of Hades, where time has no meaning and all stories end the same way, Orpheus and Eurydice dance their eternal dance. He plays, she moves to his music, and in their harmony is a truth too deep for the living to understand, that some loves are too large for one lifetime, that some songs can only be completed in silence, that sometimes the only way to hold something forever is to let it go. The myth ends where all myths must, not with answers but with echoes, not with certainty, but with the music that remains when the last note fades. And in that music, Orpheus and Eurydice live still, teaching each generation anew the terrible arithmetic of love. That to love is to risk loss, that to look is to doubt, that to be human is to fail at the crucial moment, and that perhaps, in the end, it is the failing that makes us human, and the love that makes the failing worthwhile.